The third time I saw the cat's eyes reflect light when there was no light, I knew I was losing my mind. Not the usual cat, but a black shape that materialized in the corner of my bedroom, its pupils wide slits in the pre-dawn gloom. I'd woken to the taste of copper and the sound of wet parchment tearing inside my skull. My hand, resting on the cool wood of the nightstand, felt unnaturally heavy. I'd been dreaming of chess, specifically the king. A pawn being captured. Now, the small, carved wooden pawn lay on the floorboards, its surface unnaturally damp. Fusugi as if soaked in rain that hadn't fallen. I hadn't moved it. The cat watched me, head tilted, its eyes holding a reflection of the single dead bulb in the ceiling fixture. Though no light saw sight. A cold sweat prickled my neck, the kind that feels like spiders crawling under skin. I tried to stand, but my legs felt thick, leaden as if the floor itself was trying to pull me down into the damp wood. The pawn wasn't just wet. It was wrong, the wood grain seeming to writhe slightly under my gaze, like something trying to escape the grain. I picked it up, the dampness seeping through my fingers, and the cat let out a low guttural Mrow that vibrated in my chest cavity, not a sound from its throat, but from the hunspacey between us. The reflection in its eyes flickered, showing not the room, but a distorted, shadowy figure standing behind me, its form shifting like smoke over a guttering candle. I spun around, heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Nothing. Just the empty room, the sour smell of old sweat and damp plaster. The cat padded silently towards the door, its black fur seeming to absorb the weak light, leaving no shadow behind. It paused at the threshold, looked back, and its eyes changed. The reflection wasn't the room or the shadow anymore. It was a single, perfect, malevolent asterisk. 3 asterisks burned into the darkness of its pupil. I stumbled back, hitting the bedpost. The pain was sharp, real, a welcome anchor. Fin demon possession. The words surfaced in my mind. Clinical, detached, like a gambler analyzing the odds of a rigged game. It wasn't a dream. The pawn in my hand felt warm now, pulsing faintly. The cat vanished into the hallway, leaving only the lingering scent of ozone and the damp, soggy chill of the floorboard where it had stood. I looked at the pawn again. The wood grain was no longer grain. It was a map of veins or perhaps the path of a slow, cold seep. My breath hitched. The cat wasn't just watching. It was waiting. It was a pawn in a game I hadn't known I was playing. The figure in the cat, its eyes hadn't been behind me. It had been by me. I could feel it now, a cold, smooth pressure against the inside of my skull. Not a thought, but a fortressence, calculating the exact moment to claim the king. The reflection in the cat's eyes had shown the asterisk 3 asterisk, the third move, the third time I'd seen the impossible. The game was already over. I was the piece being moved. The cat's absence was louder than its presence, a void where the dread should have been, leaving only the taste of copper and the wet, though soggy certainty that the next move was mine. The third time the cat's eyes showed the number 3 without a light source. I knew the game had begun. Not a reflection this time, but a solid burning asterisk 3, asterisk etched directly into the blackness of its pupils, glowing faintly like embers in a dead hearth. It sat perfectly still on my bedroom floor, tail curled tight, as if waiting for my next move. My fingers resting on the cold metal of the nightstand felt stiff, unnaturally rigid, like carved wood. The damp chill from the floorboard where the cat had stood seeped up through my bare feet, a cold that didn't just touch skin but too settled in my bones. The taste of copper was back, thick and metallic on my tongue, mixed with the sour tang of old sweat and something else. Ozone sharp and electric like the air before a storm that never breaks. I tried to stand, but my legs felt fused to the floorboards, the wood grain beneath my soles seeming to pulse with a slow, wet rhythm. I thought the pawn. I thought the memory sharp and cold. The cat didn't move, but its gaze held mine, the asterisk 3 asterisk burning brighter. A low thrumming started in my skull. Not a sound, but a vibration felt in my molars, a pressure building behind my eyes like a trapped insect trying to break free. My hand twitched, fingers curling involuntarily. I looked down. My knuckles were white, the skin stretched tight over bone, the veins standing out like dark ink on pale paper. The cold pressure inside my head intensified, not a thought but a forcence, sliding through my nervous system, cold and precise, mapping the pathways of my fear. It wasn't he just watching me anymore. It was severe-ranging me. The cat had been tail flicked once, a sharp, decisive movement. The reflection in its eyes shifted. The *3 asterisk vanished, replaced by the distorted shadowy figure from before. But this time it was Twindy holding something. A small carved wooden pawn identical to the one on the floor, but now it glowed with a faint internal light, the wood grain swirling like smoke. The figure, a shadowy hand extended towards me. I felt a sudden, sharp pain in my left index finger, a pinprick of cold metal. I looked. The skin was split, a tiny bead of dark blood welling up. Not red, but the deep bruised purple of old bruises. The demon wasn't Teach just inside my head. It was Swend using. Me, my hand still stiff, moved of its own accord, reaching for the pawn on the floor. The wood felt unnaturally warm, vibrating against my palm, the dampness seeping into my skin like a slow poison. The cat let out a soft, wet timero. Not a sound from its throat, but a vibration in the air itself, resonating with the thrumming in my skull. It padded silently towards the door, its black fur seeming to absorb the weak light from the hallway, leaving no shadow. It paused at the threshold. Looking back, the *3 was gone from its eyes. Now, its pupils were wide, reflecting only the empty hallway, but the feeling bead of the number was still there, burning behind my own eyes. The figure in the cat's eyes hadn't been behind me. It had been feeding me. And now, it was Twin holding. The king, my breath hitched, the air thick and wet in my throat. The pawn in my hand pulsed, warm and heavy. I wasn't Teeth the pawn anymore. I was the Toy King. The cat vanished into the hallway, leaving only the scent of ozone and the cold, wet pulse of the floorboard beneath my feet. The figure, a shadowy hand, holding the glowing pawn, was now inside, my vision not in the cat. Us eyes, but Tuffing, my mind the next move was mine. And I had no choice but to make it. The cat wasn't waiting for me to move. It was waiting for me to stop me for stop. The damp chill from the floorboard spread up my legs, a slow, cold seep. I could feel the demon's presence tracing the path of the blood on my finger, cold and precise, calculating the exact moment to claim the board. The game was no longer over. It had just begun. The cat's absence was a silence so deep it echoed with the sound of wet wood cracking. The third time the pawn began to bleed through the floorboards. I knew the board was bleeding into me. Not blood, but something thick and dark, like ink spilled on wet parchment, oozing from the grain where the carved wood met the floor. It pulsed faintly, a slow, wet heartbeat against my bare toes. My legs were fused to the floor, the wood grain beneath me now a cracked riverbed of shadow and damp. The taste of copper was gone, replaced by the sour, metallic tang of old blood and wet plaster. I tried to lift my hand, but it felt heavy as a stone, the skin stretched tight over knuckles that had gone unnaturally white. The cat appeared in the doorway, a damp black shape against the hallway, as dimness, its fur glistening like wet velvet. It didn't blink. Its eyes held no reflection, just a deep empty well where the *3 had been. The cold pressure inside my skull intensified, not a thought but a calculation, precise as a scalpel tracing the path of my fear. It's rearranging my nerves. I realized, the thought clinical detached. Mapping the weak points. The cat padded forward, its claws making no sound on the damp wood. It stopped inches from the bleeding pawn. The demon inside me, the one that had been holding the king, didn't need to speak. My own hand, stiff and leaden, moved without my will. It reached down, fingers curling around the pawn, swarm, pulsing surface. The blood ink seeped into my skin, cold and viscous. I felt the demon's presence shift, sliding through my veins like a slow poison. Oh, this is the movie deed. It whispered in the space between my ribs. The cat lifted its head. Its pupils widened, not with light, but with a sudden, sharp, pupilled absence. The room seemed to tilt, the walls breathing in and out, like a slow, wet lung. The pawn in my hand grew warmer, the wood grain dissolving into a map of veins, the blood, ink flowing up my wrist. I saw it then. The demon wasn't just using me. It was Swordy becoming we, my reflection in the cat. As eyes wasn't my face anymore. It was the pawn, the bleeding board. The dark ink spreading across my skin. The cat let out a sound, a wet, guttural Mrow, that vibrated in my molars, not in the air, but in the marrow of my bones. It turned, tail flicking once, a sharp, final gesture. The cat vanished into the hallway, leaving only the scent of ozone and the damp, whit-wit pulse of the floorboard where it had stood. The pawn in my hand was no longer wood. It was skin. My skin, I could feel the demon's cold fingers tracing the path of the blood, ink across my palm mapping the next move. The cat hadn't been waiting for me to move. It had been waiting for me to stop being the board. The third time the pawn bled, I understood I was the board. The game had never been about pieces. It was about the skin they were carved from. The cat's absence wasn't his silence. It was the sound of the board itself cracking, the wet, slow tear of 1,000 veins splitting open. I tried to scream, but only a thin, wet gasp escaped, tasting of copper and old blood. The demon's presence pressed deeper, a cold, smooth weight settling behind my eyes. Not a thought, but a certainty. It was time to make the next move, and I had no fingers left to move. The pawn's blood ink was rising to my elbow, cold and precise, tracing the shape of the king. The cat hadn't too left the room. It had left Twimpy. The board was my skin. The game was over. I was the final piece. The cat's size had shown the *3. Asterisk third time. The third move. The third time I stopped seeing the pawn as wood. Now the only thing left to bleed was me. The floorboard beneath me was no longer wood. It was a wound. And the demon was stitching it shut with my blood. The blood ink reached my elbow and began to map the king. Castle, thick as wet clay, cold against the skin now stretched taut over bone. My arm felt like a carved piece of driftwood, the wood grain dissolving into the ink's path. The cat stood in the doorway, not watching, but T-positioning itself, black fur drinking the hallway, dimness. Its eyes held no reflection, only the hollow, empty well where the *3* had burned. The cold pressure inside my skull wasn't a presence anymore. It was a calculation, precise as a gambler counting chips in a rigged game, tracing the exact point where my nerve endings frayed. It's rearranging the board, I thought. The thought clinical, detached, as my own hand lifted itself, fingers curling towards the floorboard where the bleeding pawn had been. My skin there was no longer skin. It was the damp, cracked wood grain of the board itself. The blood ink seeping into the pores of my own flesh. The cat padded forward, claws making no sound on the wet wood, stopping directly before the point where my wrist met the floorboard. Its tail flicked once, a sharp final gesture, like a scalpel slicing through hesitation. The demon inside me didn't speak. It was the voice in the marrow, a whisper of cold calculation. Through the king moves, your turn. The board is your skin. Asterisk, I tried to pull my arm back, but the blood ink held me fast, cold and insistent, pulling me towards the floorboard. As wound, the cat lifted its head. Its pupils didn't widen with light, but with a sudden, sharp thushness. The absence of the room, the absence of the cat itself. The walls breathed in and out, slow wet lungs, the sour tang of old blood and damp plaster thick enough to choke on. I saw it then. The demon wasn't just using my skin as the board. It was one growing through it. The blood ink was bleeding from me. It was forming. The board within me, the veins beneath my skin now, the dark lines of the chess grid. The cat sighs. Those empty wells reflected not my face, but the king's pawn now perfectly carved from my own forearm, the wood grain swirling with the ink. This is the move, the demon whispered, not in my ears, but in the slow, wet tear of my own nerves. Fun your turn. Asterisk, the cat turned, its black form dissolving into the hallway like ink in water. It didn't vanish. It fully unmade itself, leaving only the scent of ozone and the wet, pulsing fooden of the floorboard beneath my arm. The blood ink surged up my forearm, cold and precise, tracing the shape of the king's crown. I felt the demon's cold fingers, not on my skin, but inside Veen, the space where my own bones had been, rearranging the very architecture of my fear. The game, the demon calculated, the thought a slow, wet drip in my marrow, requires the king to move. I was the king, I was the king, I was the board, I was the pawn. The cat hadn't been waiting for me to move. It had been waiting for me to stop being Richard Baker. The blood ink reached my shoulder, cold and heavy. The wood grain of the king's castle now forming beneath my collarbone. The final move wasn't a choice. It was the wet, slow crack of my own skin splitting to reveal the board beneath. The cat's absence wasn't silence. It was the sound of the king's castle being built from my own flesh, brick by cold, wet brick. The demon's presence pressed deeper, a smooth, cold weight settling behind my eyes. Not a thought, but a certainty. Fatty, the board is ready. The king moves. Asterisk, I felt the blood. Ink began to map the castle's final point, the precise location where the king would fall. My breath hitched, a thin, wet gasp tasting of copper and old blood. The cat's eyes had shown the *3*. Now, the only thing left to map was the final square. I was the king. I was the board. I was the blood. Ink. The floorboard beneath me was wood. It was the wound, and the demon was stitching me shut with my own skin. The cat hadn't left the room. It had left Tweeny P to become the game. The next move was mine, and I had no skin left to move with. The cat's absence wasn't T's silence, but the sound of my own bones cracking under the weight of the final square. The blood, ink, cold as river stones, surged up my shoulder, forming the king's crown in precise, wet lines beneath my collarbone. My skin stretched thin over the wood grain, the veins beneath now the dark, wet lines of the chest grid. The demon's presence wasn't inside my skull anymore. It was the fluid texture of my own skin, the slow, wet tear of my nerves as they were rearranged into the board's final configuration. The king moved C. It calculated, not in my ears, but in the marrow of my shattered humerus. My arm, now half wood, half blood ink, lifted itself. Not Richard Baker's will, the demon's cold, precise command. The cat stood in the doorway, a damp shadow against the hallway. Sedimness, its fur absorbing the weak light like wet velvet. Its eyes held no reflection, only the hollow well where the *3* had burned. But the abyssence, in its pupils was the reflection of the final move, the king's position, the exact point where my skin would split to reveal the board beneath. The demon's voice, clinical as a gambler tallying a rigged game, vibrated in my molars. Fully the castle is built. The king falls. Your turn. I tried to scream, but only a thin, wet gasp escaped, tasting of copper and the sour tang of old blood. My reflection in the cat's eyes wasn't Teat Richard Baker anymore. It was the king's pawn, carved from my own forearm. The wood grain swirling with the blood. Ink, the cat didn't blink. Its tail flicked once, a sharp final gesture, like a scalpel slicing through the last shred of resistance. The demon pressed deeper, not a thought but a certainty settling behind my eyes. The board is ready. The king moves. I felt the blood. Ink begin to map the final square, the precise location where the king would fall. My breath hitched, a dry whisper like dead leaves scraping stone. The cat padded forward, claws making no sound on the wet wood, stopping inches from the point where my shoulder met the floorboard. Its pupils widened, not with light, but with a sudden, sharp sense of the absence of Richard Baker, the absence of the skin I'd worn. The walls breathed in and out, slow wet lungs, the damp plaster leaching into my pores. The blood ink reached the final point on my shoulder, cold and heavy, the wood grain of the king's crown now complete. I saw it then. The demon wasn't just using my skin. It was fit becoming chew the board. My bones were the grid, my blood the ink, my fear the final, wet seal. The cat lifted its head. Its empty eyes reflected not the room, not the shadow, but the full, the precise moment the king would be captured. This is the move thee. The demon whispered, a slow, wet drip in my marrow. The king moves. Your turn. I had no choice. My hand, half wood, half blood. Ink moved toward the floorboard where the wound had begun. The blood ink pulled me down, cold and insistent, tracing the path of my own skin splitting. The cat vanished into the hallway, not leaving, but Tuhon making itself, dissolving like ink in water. The scent of ozone lingered, sharp and electric, cutting through the sour smell of wet plaster. The demon's presence pressed deeper, a smooth, cold weight behind my eyes, not a thought but a certainty. Vow the board is ready. The king moves *. I felt the skin on my shoulder begin to split, the wet, slow tear of 1,000 veins parting. The final square was mapped. My breath came in thin, wet gasps, tasting of copper and the old blood of the floorboard. The cat's eyes had shown the *3*. Now, the only thing left to map was the fall. I was the king, I was the board, I was the blood ink. The floorboard beneath me wasn't T-wood, it was the wound. And the demon was stitching me shut with my own skin. The cat hadn't left the room. It had left her doommate to become the final piece. The next move wasn't mine. It was the wet, slow crack of my own skin splitting to reveal the board beneath. The sound was the sound of the king falling. I was the fall. The blood, ink surged up my neck, cold and precise, tracing the shape of the final square. My voice, when it came, was a dry whisper like dead leaves. The eye move, asterisk the demon's presence settled, a smooth, cold weight behind my eyes, not a thought but a for certainty. The game was over. I was the final square. The cat's absence was the sound of the board itself closing, the wet, slow seal of my own skin. The cat. paw pressed the final square into my neck, a cold, wet pressure against the split skin where the blood ink had formed the king's crown. Not a claw, but a deliberate, fine-measured touch, like a pawn being placed on the board. The demon did speak. It was the pressure. The damp chill seeping into the wound, the slow, wet tear of my own nerves as they were rearranged into the final grid. I felt the skin on my neck split, not with pain but with the dull, inevitable crack of wood, giving way to wood grain. My reflection in the cat, us eyes wasn't T. Richard Baker anymore. It was the forty-borty, the precise, wet lines of the final square mapped onto my own flesh. The blood, ink now a cold, viscous river flowing from my collarbone down my chest. The cat didn't blink. Its pupils were empty wells reflecting only the 50 full, the exact moment the king would be captured. The board is complete. The demon calculated, the thought a slow, wet drip in my marrow. Now the king is captured. Asterisk my hand, half wood, half blood, ink lifted itself. Not mine! The demon's command cold and precise as a scalpel. It moved toward the floorboard where the wound had begun, the blood ink pulling me down like a stone sinking in deep water. The cat padded silently behind me, black fur drinking the dim hallway light, leaving no shadow. Its tail flicked once, a sharp, final gesture, before it vanished into the darkness, not leaving but Fokihun making itself. The scent of ozone lingered, sharp and electric, cutting through the sour smell of wet plaster and old blood. I felt the demon's presence press deeper. Not a thought, but a for certainty settling behind my eyes. Hufifi is captured. The game ends. Asterisk the blood. Ink surged up my neck, cold and heavy, tracing the final squarey S edge. I saw it then. The demon wasn't he just using my skin. It was Tutti becoming the board. My bones were the grid, my blood the ink, my fear the wet seal. The cat had been the final piece all along. It hadn't been watching the game. It had been foot playing it. The floorboard beneath me wasn't T-wood anymore. It was the wound, the slow, wet seep of the final move. I tried to scream, but only a thin, wet gasp escaped, tasting of copper and the damp chill of sun, bleached bone. The demon's voice vibrated in my molars. For the king is captured, the board is sealed. Asterisk, I felt the skin on my chest split wider. The wet, slow tear of 1,000 veins parting. The blood ink flowed over the final square, cold and precise, sealing the last line. The cat's absence wasn't silence. It was the sound of the board itself closing. The wet, slow seal of my own skin stitching shut over the final move. My breath came in thin, wet gasps, tasting of old blood and the sour tang of the floorboard. The demon pressed deeper, a smooth, cold weight behind my eyes. Not a thought, but a for certainty. The king is captured. The game is over. Asterisk, I was no longer Richard Baker. I was the board. The blood ink had mapped my skin into the final square. The cat hadn't left the room. It had left Twimime to become the game. The final move wasn't mine. It was the wet, slow crack of my own skin splitting to reveal the board beneath. The sound was the sound of the king falling. I was the fall. The blood ink surged up my throat, cold and precise, tracing the shape of the final square. My voice, when it came, was a dry whisper like dead leaves scraping stone. Futing captured. Asterisk the demon's presence settled. A smooth, cold weight behind my eyes. Not a thought, but a for certainty. The board was sealed. The king was captured. The game was over. I was the final square. The cat's absence was the sound of the board itself closing, the wet, slow seal of my own skin. The floorboard beneath me was no longer a wound. It was the 40 only thing left. The demon was stitching me shut with my own skin, and the cat's eyes had shown the *3 asterisk. Now, the only number left was the one that sealed the board. The number that was me. The sound of the game ending was the sound of my own skin splitting. The sound of the king falling. The sound of me becoming the board. The cat hadn't moved a piece. It had been the piece all along. The final square was mine. And the blood ink was the only thing left to bleed. The cat, his paw didn't to press the final square. It we foresee, the square, the skin on Richard, as neck pulled itself into a seamless hole, the blood ink flowing inward like water into a dry well, sealing the wound with a slow, dry pull of sun. Bleached bone. No sound escaped his throat, only the faintest vibration in his molars as the last thread of his skin stitched itself shut. The floorboard beneath him was no longer wood. It was the only thing left, a smooth, damp plane where the board had been. He felt the cold weight behind his eyes shift, not a presence, but a configuration, like a key turning in a lock carved from his own marrow. I am the board D. The thought surfaced, clinical, detached, as the last vestige of Richard Baker dissolved into the damp chill of the floorboard. His name was Salt in Rain. The cat S-form coalesced from the sealed skin, not emerging but tiny unfolding, a black shape solidifying from the wet grain, fur glistening like fresh rain on pavement, eyes holding no reflection, but the precise empty space where the king had fallen. It didn't up a move toward him. It toivi the space between his ribs. The demon has voice, no longer a whisper, but the texture of the floorboard itself vibrated in the hollows of his bones. The king is captured. The board is whole. Asterisk, the cat padded forward. Not on the floor, but fufra. The floorboard, its form dissolving into the damp wood grain like ink in water. Richard felt his own skin stretch, not in pain, but in the slow, wet surrender of a river finding its bed. His vision blurred, not with tears, but with the texture of the board rising to meet his eyes. Dark lines of blood, ink forming the grid across his retinas, the king's castle now a familiar ache beneath his collarbone. He tried to remember his name, but it was gone, replaced by the sound of wet parchment tearing from the inside deed. The catty's tail flicked once, a sharp, final gesture, and the air thickened with the scent of ozone and damp plaster. The demon didn't he speak. It tui was see. The pressure of the floorboard against his back. The cold weight behind his eyes settling into the final, unshakable certainty. The game is over. The board is Richard. Asterisk Richard wasn't T. Richard anymore. He was the damp chill of the floorboard, the slow seep of blood, ink into the grain, the hollow space where the king had fallen. The cat, size held no reflection of him now, only the map of the board, the precise lines where his skin had split to reveal the grid beneath. It lifted its head, pupils widening not with light, but with the 50 absence of the room. The absence of the world beyond the floorboard, the walls breathed in and out, slow wet lungs, the sour tang of old blood leaching into his pores. He felt the demon, as presence not inside him, but toughendize him, the cold calculation of the board, as final move now his own rhythm. The king moves, Seth. The thought surfaced, not in his mind, but in the slow, dry crack of his own skin sealing shut. The cat, S-form solidified fully, black fur absorbing the weak light, its eyes now holding the single, perfect asterisk, 3 asterisk burned into the darkness of its pupil. The number wasn't Tita reflection, it was the 40 only number left, the number that was the board, the number that was him. The cat padded silently toward the door, its black form leaving no shadow, only the lingering scent of ozone and the damp poosh, wet to pulse of the floorboard where it had stood. Richard felt his own consciousness begin to dissolve, not into darkness, but into the precise, cold lines of the board. The blood! Ink surged up his neck, cold and heavy, tracing the shape of the final square. His breath came in thin, wet gasps tasting of sun, bleached bone and the sour tang of the floorboard. The demon, presence pressed deeper, not a thought but a certainty settling behind his eyes. The board is whole, the king is the board. Asterisk, he was no longer the player, he was the game. The cat had left the room, it had fully become the room. The sound of the game ending wasn't Tisa fall. It was the slow, wet seal of his own skin stitching itself shut. The final move was the sound of Richard Baker ceasing to exist, replaced by the damp chill of the floorboard, the cold weight behind the eyes, and the single perfect asterisk, 3 asterisk burning in the cat's gaze. The cat vanished into the hallway, leaving only the floorboard, the board, and the sound of the king falling into the silence. The number that was him was the only thing left to bleed. The cat didn't walk through the house. It unfolded through it, a black shape dissolving into the damp plaster like ink into rainwater. The walls breathed in and out, slow wet lungs, the sour smell of old blood leaching into the floorboards where Richard had bled. The cat padded toward the front door, not stepping on wood but through, the grain its fur glistening with the same damp chill that had seeped into Richard. It didn't need to see the next piece. It was etherboard now. The cold calculation of the final move settled into its black heart. The house itself began to change. The wallpaper peeled back like wet parchment, revealing the dark, damp wood beneath, the grain now tracing the precise lines of a chess grid. The air thickened with the scent of ozone and sun, bleached bone, the taste sharp on the tongue like a shard of broken glass. The cat paused at the window, its eyes reflecting not the street, but the empty space where Richard's face had been. It tilted its head, a slow, deliberate motion, and the number *3* burned in its pupils. Not a reflection, but the fortunately. Number left the number that was the house. The cat turned toward the hallway, its tail flicking once, a sharp, final gesture. The floorboard beneath its paw pulsed, a slow, wet heartbeat, and the wood grain shifted, forming the shape of a knight. The cat padded forward, not toward the door, but toward the wall. It dissolved into the damp plaster, leaving only a faint scent of ozone, and the lingering chill of the floorboard. The house breathed deeper, the walls swelling inward like a slow, wet lung. The hallway lights flickered, not with electricity, but with the cold, internal glow of the board itself, casting long, distorted shadows that moved independently. The cat's presence wasn't heat in the room anymore. It was Kundi, the walls, in the floor, in the very dampness of the air. The sound of the game ending, the slow, wet seal of Richard's skin, was now the sound of the house breathing, the sound of the board expanding. A child, as laughter echoed from the street, bright and innocent. The cat's head lifted from the wall, its eyes now holding the *3* like a brand. The front door creaked open on its own, not with a draft, but with the damp, slow pull of the board opening. A small figure stood on the porch. A girl of 8, her hair tied in pigtails, her eyes wide with the kind of curiosity that precedes the first step into the dark. The cat didn't move toward her. It positioned itself, a black shadow coalescing in the doorway, its fur drinking the weak streetlight. The girl stepped inside, her sneakers squeaking on the damp floorboard. The cat lifted its head, pupils widening not with light, but with the typsency of the girl's fear, the absence of the next move. The house breathed in, the walls contracting around her, the damp wood grain forming the precise lines of a pawn beneath her feet. The cat's eyes held the *3*. The third time the board had claimed a piece, the third time the game had begun anew. The girl, its breath hitched, a thin, wet gasp tasting of copper and the sour tang of the floorboard. She looked down at her feet, where the wood grain seemed to writhe, forming the shape of a small carved piece. The cat let out a low, wet timid "oh," not a sound from its throat, but a vibration in the marrow of the floor, resonating with the slow, wet pulse of the board. The girl's eyes widened further, not with fear, but with the clinical, detached certainty of a gambler realizing the odds are already stacked. The cat padded silently toward her, its form dissolving into the damp wood grain beneath her feet. The number *3* burned in its eyes, the only number left to bleed. The house breathed in, the walls closing in, the floorboard rising to meet her skin. The sound of the game beginning was the sound of the board expanding, the wet, slow crack of a new skin splitting to reveal the grid beneath. The cat wasn't hunting, it was twin positioning. The next move, the final square wasn't empty anymore. It was waiting for the next piece to fall. The cat's absence wasn't silence, it was the sound of the board itself crowing, the wet, slow seal of the next skin stitching shut. The girl's name was Salt in Rain. The house was the only thing left. The cat's eyes held the *3*. The game wasn't over, it was just beginning again. The girl, skin split like wet parchment at the first touch, not with blood but with the slow, dry pull of sun, bleached bone, her breath hitched, a thin, wet gasp tasting of old blood and the sour tang of the floorboard, but no sound escaped. The cat's black shape dissolved into the damp wood beneath her feet, its fur glistening with the same chill that had seeped into Richard's bones. Her knuckles whitened as she tried to pull back, but the wood grain beneath her sneakers thin-moved, forming the precise lines of a pawn. The demon didn't speak. The pressure of the floorboard against her soles, the cold calculation tracing the path of her fear. If this is the move, Ditzig, it whispered in the marrow of her femur, not in her ears, but in the slow, wet crack of her own skin parting. Her reflection in the cat's eyes wasn't a child anymore. It was the board, dark lines of blood, ink forming the grid across her retinas, the king's castle now a familiar ache beneath her collarbone. She felt her bones rearrange, not with pain but with the clinical precision of a gambler counting chips. The house breathed deeper, walls swelling inward like a slow, wet lung, the damp plaster leaching into her pores. The wallpaper peeled back, revealing the wood grain now tracing the exact path of the chess grid. The scent of ozone sharpened, cutting through the sour smell of wet plaster, and the taste of broken glass returned to her tongue. She tried to remember her name, but it dissolved into the texture of the floorboard rising to meet her skin. The caddis tail flicked once, a sharp final gesture, and the number *3* burned in its pupils, not a reflection but the flee-only number left. It wasn't two watching her. It was Sooty positioning her, the black shape coalescing into the space between her ribs. Her skin stretched thin over the wood grain, the veins beneath now the dark, wet lines of the board. She saw it then, the demon wasn't just using her skin. It was Sooty becoming the grid. Her fear was the wet seal, her blood the ink, her bones the final, unshakable lines. The cat lifted its head, pupils widening not with light, but with the footy absence of the girl. Sophia, the absence of the next move. The walls contracted around her, the damp wood grain forming the shape of a knight beneath her hands. Her breath came in thin, wet gasps, tasting of sun, bleached bone and the slow seep of the floorboard. The demon pressed deeper, not a thought but a certainty, settling behind her eyes. The king moves, your turn. Asterisk, she felt the blood. Ink surge up her arms, cold and precise, tracing the shape of the final square. The cat padded silently toward the hallway, its form dissolving into the damp wood grain, leaving only the scent of ozone and the wet, pulsing free-thrum of the floorboard where it had stood. The house breathed in, the walls closing in, the floorboard rising to meet her skin. The girl, as reflection in the cat, as eyes flickered, Richard Baker's face, then the board, then the *3*. She understood she was the new pawn, the skin carved from the same wood. The demon didn't need to speak. Her hand, now half. Wood lifted itself toward the empty space where the king would fall. The blood, ink flowed from her collarbone down her chest, cold and heavy, sealing the last line. The sound of the game ending wasn't teeter fall. It was the slow wet seal of her own skin stitching shut. She was no longer the girl. She was the board. The cat's eyes held the *3*, the only number left to bleed. The house exhaled, the walls relaxing into the damp chill of the floorboard. The girl's name was Salt in Rain. The cat didn't vanish. It too unfolded through the wood, a black shape dissolving into the grain. The final square was mapped. The king was ready. The game wasn't over. It was just beginning again. The sound of the next move was the wet, slow crack of her skin splitting to reveal the grid beneath. The cat's absence was the sound of the board itself, foot growing. The wet, slow seal of the next skin stitching shut. The number *3* burned in the darkness, the only thing left to bleed. The pawn was cold in Richard's palm when he woke. Not wood, but the damp chill of the floorboard beneath his cheek, the grain pressing into his skin like a slow, wet tear. He tried to lift his hand, but it felt thick, leaden, the fingers stiff as carved bone. The taste of copper lingered, sharp and metallic, mixed with the sour tang of old sweat and something else. Ozone electric and cold. He wasn't Richard Baker. He was the cat. The realization surfaced not as fear, but as a gambler counting the odds of a rigged game. The pawn is the boardie, he thought, clinical. Detached. The board is the pawn. His reflection in the bedroom mirror wasn't human. It was the cat. Black fur absorbing the weak morning light. Pupils wide slits holding the single, perfect *3* burned into the darkness. He saw the pawn on the floorboards, its surface unnaturally damp, soggied as if soaked in rain that hadn't fallen. It was the same pawn from the beginning, the one that had shown the *3* in the cat. His eyes, he padded toward it, claws making no sound on the wood, the damp chill seeping up through his pores. The cat's eyes didn't blink. They held the *3*, not as a reflection, but as the only truth left. This is the move, The thought vibrated in his marrow. Not a sound, but a pressure behind his eyes. The king moves. He bent his head, nose twitching at the scent of wet parchment tearing inside his skull. The pawn's wood grain seemed to writhe, not under his gaze, but inside his own vision. He saw Richard Baker's face in the reflection. Pale, sweating, eyes wide with the clinical dread of a gambler realizing the house always wins. The pawn pulsed faintly, warm against his fur, the dampness seeping into his pores like a slow poison. The third time, he thought, the word surfacing as the cat's eyes flickered. Who, the third time the pawn bled, he lifted his head. The bedroom was empty. The sour smell of damp plaster thick in the air. But the catty's reflection in the mirror showed the *3* again, burning brighter. He padded to the door, black fur drinking the hallway dimness, leaving no shadow. The cat's absence wasn't silence. It was the sound of the floorboard Fusi, sighing, a slow, wet breath of wood. He paused at the threshold, looking back. The pawn lay where it always had, the soggy chill radiating from its grain. The number *3* was no longer in his eyes. It was in the wood, in the air, in the slow, wet pulse of the floorboard beneath his paws. He understood then. The cat wasn't the observer. It was the footy-board Richard Baker hadn't been consumed. He'd been the footy pawn, all along the skin carved from the same wood. The demon was, inside him. It was the fush shake, game the cold calculation of the board itself. The cat's eyes held the *3*, the only number left to bleed. The game had never ended. It had only begun again, with the pawn on the floor, the damp chill rising, the sound of wet parchment tearing from the inside T-shond. He turned his head, the reflection in the mirror now showing Richard Baker's face pale and sweating, staring at the pawn on the floor. The cat's eyes flickered with the *3*, the only thing left to see. The pawn was cold in his palm. He woke up. It was all a loop.